Greetings hobbyists, this is Artisans of All. In this video we're going to have a look at how we can make procedural dragon scales to add to things like dragon skin cloaks. So what we're aiming to do in this video is to make a geometry node setup that we can use to create an asset or not, and then we can bring this in and change various attributes. For example, we could, increase the size on one direction, and then we can change the size of the scales to be either bigger or smaller. We can change what the scales look like slightly and how random they are, and then we can change things like the gap between the scales, so we can make that bigger or smaller, and we could change things like how rounded they are, so they could be less rounded or more rounded. And we can also change things like the thickness of the scales as well to make them thicker or thinner. We'll also have a look at how we could add these scales to something like a cloak, which does require a couple of extra stages that we can't do in geometry nodes. So we'll go through this geometry node setup relatively quickly. One, because otherwise this video is going to take forever and you can always rewatch bits if I go through it too fast. And two, I've already done this once before, I just forgot to press the record button. Yeah, I know, really smooth move there. Anyway, so we're just going to drag this up to start our geometry nodes. And if you haven't got this, then just make sure you've got geometry node editor selected there. Click on any object. I'm just going to use the default cube. Yeah, another bit of madness actually sticking with the default cube. And then we're going to press new. If you start really zoomed out from your geometry nodes, just A and then the decimal point on your number pad, and it will zoom in. And we don't actually want to use this geometry, so I'm just going to press Control and right click to cut that out. Now I'm using Node Wrangler for this. It's an add-on that comes with Blender, so do make sure you've got that activated. I'm going to use a few of those shortcuts throughout this. So what we need here is a plane, and then we're going to subdivide it because we want to put a texture on it to make that dragon scale-like shape. Now, while I said I'm going to go through this quickly, I do want to explain what I'm doing. So we want a plane and we need to subdivide it, and we can do that very quickly in geometry nodes. Shift and A, and if we just type in grid, we get a mesh primitive for the grid, and that effectively is going to be a subdivided plane. With Node Wrangler on, Shift Alt and then left click, we've got our plane here. And you can see we've got the size of this. Let's up this in size to, let's say, 10, though we're going to want to be able to control that on our modifier setup that you saw over on the right hand side when I demoed this. And just to give an idea of what this is looking like, if I turn on wireframe, we can see that at the moment we've got our sizes, so 10 on the X and 10 on the Y, and we've got 3 vertices on the X and 3 vertices on the Y, so 1 here, 2 there, 3 there. And we can increase this as much as we want. So effectively this is going to be our subdivide for us. So I'm just going to drag both of those and put in something like 100, so we've got a lot there. We're probably going to need more, but we'll deal with that as it comes. Now, as I said, we don't want to have to constantly be going to geometry nodes. We want to just be able to drag something in and not have to go into the geometry nodes. So we want all of the information out on the side panel here. So all we're going to do is grab our group input where we had our geometry, which we don't care about. I'm just going to put the size X, size Y, vertices X and vertices Y into the group input, and you'll see that makes them appear on this side. Now we could combine these together so that just one option affects both of them, but we might want something that's rectangular like that, and it's just easier to keep them separated. Let's just put that back to 10 for now. So this is what we're going to use as our starting point. But importantly, we need to add this texture onto our grid. And the easiest way to do that is with something called a Voronoi texture. So Shift A, start typing in Voronoi and bring in that Voronoi texture. We'll bring that up here. Now to show what we mean here and what this is doing, I'm going to press Control Shift and then right click, and that brings in this viewer. You can also, if you want to, do it with Shift and A, type in viewer, and then we've got that here. Though interestingly, if we put that, you have to then click the eye icon to make it work. Grab that grid in here and we can see what we've got. We've got this texture with these dark spots, and it looks a bit like a sort of cloudy texture. Now what we're going to do is change some of these to make this work better. Instead of this center one being F1, we want to change that to distance from edge, and then we can affect the scale to make this larger or smaller. So we want something like that. Let's get rid of the wireframe for now so we can see that more clearly. So you can see how we're getting this sort of pattern here, and we probably don't want this in 3D. You'll notice that that has some bits that are grayed out sort of here, whereas other ones are more symmetrical. If we turn this to 2D, then everything looks relatively similar with the dark parts between each of these shapes. Now, importantly, this is looking a little bit, well, pixelated, and that's because we don't have enough information on our grid here. So actually, let's just change this over here to, let's say, about 300, and suddenly that looks a lot clearer. This is very much like using a normal texture, and then we've got our subdivision making this clearer. Now, what we can also do is change how this looks a bit. For example, this random is now set to 1. We can change that about to the point where if it's 0, everything's going to be perfectly square. I actually quite like somewhere not maybe as far as that, but somewhere about here. So I'm going to put that 0.75 for now. Though we're going to be able to fiddle around with this, or we're going to want to be able to fiddle around with this and the scale. The other factors here don't really matter too much. Detail, if we put it up, puts almost like a little sort of sub shapes, and I haven't found that I've got that working particularly well, though maybe there is a way to deal with it and I just haven't done it yet. So in a similar way, we want to expose some of these options here so we can control them. So I'm just going to Shift and D to copy this group input, put that there, and we're just going to drag in the scale. We're going to need that, and we probably want the random nature of it as well. So these are going to be really worth controlling. Now, the problem is that we need to actually do something with this to make it a 3-dimensional scale. So to give you an idea what we're going to do, we are going to take all of these black parts, the bit that subdivide out all of these different shapes, and yes, I appreciate this doesn't look like the end result yet, we've got a few stages to go, but we want to end up with all of these dark parts being subtracted from a mesh. So we need to effectively just end up with all of the darker parts and nothing else. Now the reason we have to end up with the black bits and not the white bits is because for this to work, we have to have the wireframe, and the wireframe, if we keep it, will problematic, let's put it that way. So we need to start with a clean plane and then delete sections out of it. I'll go through that as we go, but I just wanted to give a sort of summary at the beginning. So what we want to do is just end up with all of these darker parts. Let's just delete out that viewer. So what we need to do is select all of this pattern that we can't see and end up with only the dark bits. So we're going to Control and A, and we need to delete some geometry. And we want to delete, well, effectively all of the whiter bits. So what we're going to do is drag that into geometry, drag that into the geometry there, and then we need to get this Voronoi texture to delete the bits that we don't want. So we can use the selection node that we've got in our delete geometry to tell it what to delete and therefore what to keep. So what we want to do is just select everything that's white and then delete that. And in Blender, all colors have a value. Black is set at 0, full on white is set at 1. So actually we can use a compare node and say that we want everything that's greater than 0, well, everything that's above 0, so let's say put it up a little bit, and we want to delete that from the geometry. And there we go. So now we've got just the bits that were black, and we can actually control how much is being deleted. Now you'll notice this moves up really quickly. If you just press Shift, you can actually move this in more finer increments. So we've got something that we can control in a relatively nice way. So this is going to be the object that we want. We want to delete this out of a plane. Now I spent a lot of time fiddling around with this because you'll notice there's quite an ugly shape to this where we've got this very jagged outline. And we can make this a little bit finer if I change my vertices and put them up to, let's say, 500, then it gets a bit smaller, but this starts to get really just silly levels of subdivision at some point. And I did spend quite a lot of time trying to work out how to do this better. And I will be perfectly clear, I did not work this out. And I want to give a very, very big shout out to Jacob Designs, who has a video that actually starts out really similar to this, where he's creating a dome that's got sort of these organic textures on it. I'm going to put a link in the description. Please do go and check out his channel and give the video a like, even if it's just as a favour to me, because honestly, this wouldn't have looked as good without that. So what he did is he worked out that what we need to do is actually just move all of these vertices, all of these points that are making up each of these sections, and we just need to sort of move them closer to each other and make them less rigid. And there is a way to do that. What we can do is we can find all of those vertices or those points and look at their position. So we're going to use a position node, but we want to move where they are. So we need to Shift A and then use a set position. So we can drag that in there, and then we can change this position to make it more fuzzy, or to blur it. This is the node that I didn't have any clue about. So if we Shift A, type in blur, and we want to blur an attribute. Position into value, value into position, and then everything disappears, because we don't want this as a float, we want this as a vector. There we go. And you can see this started to blur everything out. Now we can just make it more blurred by increasing the iterations. Now this does also make things thinner, but if you look, what we can do is if we've got it to a value somewhere here, sort of 7-ish or 8-ish, we've got these relatively flat edges and then circles towards each of the corners, or we can make it much more circular. And in combination with the greater than value here, we can then control both of these, remembering to hold down Shift as you play around with this. So we get a lot of control from these two things. So let's just firstly put in this greater than. We're going to put that there. We don't want to call this B. That is absolutely useless. So let's call this scale gap. So we've got that there. And then we also want to put in our iterations. We're going to call that smoothness. So let's Shift and A, bring in an input node. There we go, group input. And we'll drag that iterations in there. And then we can change iterations to smooth. So now we can control everything from here. We can control our scale, so how big our scales are going to be. We can control how random they are, from being perfectly the same to being more and more different. We can control the gap between the scales, and we can control how smooth they are, which also has a bit of an impact on the distance between them. Really good. So we've got everything we need. All we need to do now is add an object that we can delete this out of. But let's do this bit at a time. First, we need to actually turn this into a more solid mesh. Effectively, this is an infinitely thin plane. We need it to have some thickness. So let's Shift and A, and we want to extrude. So we've got an extrude mesh there, and this is going to look awfully messy. You can see it's a bit messy here a little bit. It's a bit difficult to make out, but you can kind of see it looks a little odd. But from the bottom, you can tell it looks really odd. That's because we've got individual set, so let's get that off. And then we've got this working, so we've got a thickness now to what's going to be our cutter. Now sometimes, actually it's not looking too bad here, sometimes this will have errors around the outside edge. Let's see if I can make that work. There we go, so somewhere sort of there. This isn't something I found a good way of doing much about. You just need to sort of fiddle around with the scale a little bit until it goes. Or we'll do something to make this relatively unimportant later. So if you do see that on yours, don't worry, there's nothing to really fix here. It will fix itself at the later stages. So we want to have this as an offset. That's going to be the thickness of our scales. So we definitely want to have that. So let's find a group input, Shift and D, and bring that over here. And we're going to have offset. So let's bring that in there. Let's rename that as thickness. So that will do for that. But we do have a problem. You might have noticed it, we don't have a bottom. This is a standard issue when you use a extrude mesh. All we need to do is add in the geometry that was there before. So let's just join geometry, plug that in there, and then we're just going to drag this geometry into the join geometry. But this hasn't actually worked at this point. It's there, but we need to merge it together, otherwise we get overlapping vertices. So all we're going to do is Shift A and then merge by distance, plug that in there. I know it doesn't look different, but it has been important, so make sure that's there. And then finally, the standard issue that we've got is if we go to face orientation, this is now facing the wrong way, so we need to flip this bottom section, what was there before, around. So Shift A and flip faces. So there we go, now we've got that all sorted. Now, you do get some weirdness again on the outside. You'll notice where this is almost infinitely thin. Again, do not worry about this. We'll sort this out in some later steps because it won't actually go right up to the edge in most instances. But that will just be a matter of fiddling with things like how smooth it is, and then suddenly that won't be a problem. Or the scale gap, and that won't be a problem as well. So it is something you have to bear in mind. Like some booleans, it's not always going to be perfect. So now that we've got this working, we need an object to boolean this out from to create the scales. So all we need is another grid. And effectively, this is going to be exactly the same grid that we started with. So I'm just going to Shift and D and bring that down here. And this is going to be our new grid. Let's Alt and Shift so that we can see that that's there. The only difference is that we don't want this grid to be broken up in any way. So I'm just going to cut through those. I'm going to put both of those down to 2. So now, again, I'll put on wireframe. We only have each vertex on each corner. So this is a nice clean plane. This does mean we're going to end up with an engon for a bit of a stage, but don't worry, we'll do something about that as one of the final stages to sort of round out the top of the scales if we want that. So now that we've got this grid there, what we need to do is delete out the geometry that we've got that's from our shape over here. Now, the problem with this, let's just get rid of our wireframe because we don't want to worry about that for this point. The issue is that at this point, these objects are perfectly the same size, both in thickness and in dimensions out to the X and Y. We actually want this to be slightly different, so I want to make this a little bit bigger. So let's just add something into our sizes. So I'm just going to Shift A, bring in a math node, and all we're going to do is, for this section here, we're just going to add in, well, it says 0.5, that's perfectly fine. Shift and D and do that on the Y as well. So now we've got this working so that this is now just a little bit bigger than our grid that's there. So it's going to prevent some overlap. We also need to do this in terms of the height. So we've got at the moment this plane, we want this to have some thickness to it, so we're going to do exactly the same thing that we did here. So let's just grab all these, Shift and D, and bring those down. So we've got to extrude this grid upwards. Let's just get rid of that and Shift Alt and click to there. So now we've got this thickness, and oh, the flip faces isn't working, so we need to drag that over there as well. Okay, so now this is all working out great, but again, it's got some thickness because we've got our input of thickness here, but we want our mesh, the one that's up here, to be slightly thicker than it. So once again, we're going to go to our extrude mesh, where we've got our offset scale, and again, we want to add some thickness to this, and we want it to be a bit thicker. So again, math node, and then we're going to just leave that as a little bit bigger. Now, we have a slight issue here, in that this has increased the size, but only in one direction. In fact, if I use a join geometry node here, and then drag in our geometry for the extruded plane, you can see that this is exactly the same position on the Z-axis at the bottom. So we actually need to move this down slightly. Let's get rid of that join geometry, we don't need it. We're just going to use another set position. We're just going to move it down on the Z, I don't know, 0.2. Oh, no, minus 0.2. There we go. So now, actually, we do want that join geometry node so I can just demonstrate what we're doing. So you can see now that this is below that plane. So we can cut this out from our plane and it will create our scales. So we don't want to join geometry. Let's delete that. We want to have, let's bring that here so we can see what there was. So we want to delete this out. So we're going to use a mesh boolean. We want to have a difference. So we've got that going in there, and we want to cut out this. And there we go. Here's all of our potential scales. And through our geometry node modifier, we can control all of the attributes we're interested in. Now at this point, I really want to have these a little bit smoother on the top. Unfortunately, with geometry nodes, we're a little bit limited here. You can actually do a form of remesh using geometry nodes. I've got a video on that. I'll put a link in the description. But here, the points are just so close to each other. The way this uses a volume to mesh basically just creates a mess. So I don't really think it's possible. If anyone's more of an expert in geometry nodes than me, which isn't that hard, I wouldn't say I'm particularly well versed in geometry nodes, please do say, because I'd love to hear it and give it a try. But instead, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to add a remesh modifier here. So add modifier, and we want remesh, or you can just do it with the normal way of typing it in. I've got a add-on that brings up the old menu. And then here we can do things with the voxel size to make it smoother or make it less smooth. Now you'll notice that this does cause a problem where things start blurring together. Now there's not much we can do about that because things are so close. We could go and fiddle around with all these settings and do that, but actually what I prefer to do is just once you're ready, apply the geometry node setup and then go into vertex mode, A, P, and then by loose parts, and then suddenly you end up with all your individual scales and then nicely smoothed. And you can go in and do whatever you want to correct these. For example, if we select this one, we could even add a subdivision surface to make that smoother should you choose to. So this isn't all perfectly contained within the geometry nodes, but I think this is a really good setup for doing this. So I'm just going to quickly run through here and make a really basic sort of cloth cape. I've actually got a video looking at this in a lot more detail. If you do want to have a look at that, again, there's a link in the description. But we're going to add our dragon scales to this. So for this, just to make life easier, we're going to use an add-on called Flowify. Also a link in the description to a video on that if you're interested in it. It's a really great add-on for doing things like this. So I'm just going to Flowify, create source grid, and that's created a source grid. This shows us what we're going to need or where we can put our objects, and then it will automatically place it onto our cloak. What we're then going to do is go to our asset browser, bring in our drag and scales there, and I'll just alternate to bring those on top of each other. And we just want a little bit of overlap, so I'm just going to do something like that. Then we can fiddle around with all of our aspects that we've put over here. So we've got all of our controls. So let's fiddle around with our size. So I'm just going to increase this up. You will notice that occasionally this does go off, and you'll notice that it sort of loses those scales for a second. So you do need to be aware of that slight issue there. You can actually go in individually and fix all of these problems, but most of the time I just tweak with the settings and then get it to the point where this works. So this isn't perfect. Let's just change the scale a bit. I want my drag and scales to be much smaller. Let's go somewhere, that's probably too small. I'm gonna go to something about there. And what I'm going to do is just to make this really easy. Do I want the gaps to be a bit bigger? No, I think I actually quite like this. So we'll just come over here, add our remesh modifier again. It makes it look messy, but that's fine. And while this is all together, I'll also Control and 2 to add in a subdivision surface on everything. Then I just apply the geometry node modifier, go into vertex mode, A, P, loose parts, and then we've got all of these scales. What I'm going to do is just select those two and H to hide them, and then I can just select the scales that I want to keep. So let's go with a kind of strip down the middle. Let's maybe select those somewhere there, and then we'll maybe actually get rid of some of the ones at the bottom. I normally avoid the ones at the perfect top because they have this sort of flat bit. Can't do much about that. And then let's get rid of that, and then let's take off the odd one here and there just to make this a little bit more interesting. Okay, Control and I to invert that, delete those out. We've got our scales, and then we'll Alt and H to bring back all of our hidden objects, and then we can just select all of our scales, unselect the plane. This is how Flowify works. Flowify, select that corner, link it to there, and then we've got our really cool drag and scale cloak. Now you'll notice this is a little bit pixelated. That's only because this isn't subdivided more. If I put this up to something like 4, it's just going to get smoother. So we don't need to worry about that. It is really easy to fix that. And we've got our cool looking drag and scales. If we want to, we can come into any of these, apply the modifier, and then we can just sculpt on them or add any additional details that we want. But I think you'll agree that is a very effective way of creating these drag and scale cloaks. And it just makes everything so fast once you've got this geometry node set up done. If you don't want to have to create this geometry node set up yourself, it is available on the Patreon, where you can get these videos a week ahead of time and ad-free. You also get other cool little bits as well, like access to the channel Discord, where you've got some great people talking through what they're doing, and you can ask for help and things like that there. If you did find that useful, hit that like button. It helps YouTube show it to other people who might be looking for the same thing, just making it easier for people to find. And once again, if you were interested in any of those other videos, the links are in the description. Have a great day, guys.